The American jet is coming straight at them. Oliver Stone throws himself into the nearest foxhole because he is certain the bombs are about to fall on his own men. Then a 500-pound bomb explodes close enough to shake the earth beneath him. Outside the wire, 16 American soldiers are trapped. One has been killed by an RPG. 11 more are wounded. Another will be killed by the American air support trying to save them. Only 3 will come through untouched. Inside the firebase, enemy soldiers have already broken through the perimeter. There is nowhere left to retreat. So the artillery crews lower their 105mm howitzers, point them almost horizontally across their own lines, and fire thousands of steel darts into the darkness. Nobody inside Firebase Burt knows who will still be alive when the sun comes up. Oliver Stone is trapped in the middle of it, and 19 years later, he will turn this night into the final battle of Platoon. But to understand how 900 American soldiers ended up fighting for their lives inside their own artillery fire, we have to go back just a few hours. The jungle is quiet, too quiet to explain what the Americans have already found. Firebase Burt sits only a few miles from the Cambodian border. It is not an established military base. It is a temporary fighting position cut into hostile country. Around 900 American soldiers occupy it. Infantrymen, mechanized troops, armored personnel carriers, machine guns, 11 105mm howitzers, 5 self-propelled 155mm guns, twin 40mm dusters, quad 5.5 caliber machine guns. If an enemy force attacks from a distance, Burt possesses enough firepower to tear it apart. But that advantage depends on one thing: distance, and somebody in the jungle has been studying exactly how to take that distance away. The first warning came the previous night, December 31st, 1967. While much of the world was preparing to welcome a new year, American listening posts beyond Burt's perimeter began hearing movement. Not gunfire, not voices, movement, men passing through vegetation in the darkness. The soldiers could not see enough to know who was there. They triggered claymore mines. Grenades went into the darkness. Then everything stopped. No assault followed. By morning, it could almost have seemed like nothing, until an American patrol went out to inspect the area. They found 2 enemy soldiers dead. One appeared to be an officer. He carried a Soviet pistol. But the weapon was not what worried the Americans. They found documents. Among them were firing calculations for an 82mm mortar. Someone had been measuring Firebase Burt. Preparing coordinates, learning where American positions were, the men outside the perimeter had not simply stumbled across Burt. They appeared to have been preparing for something. And if these men were only reconnaissance, where was the force they had been reconnoitering for? The answer was already moving toward them. At approximately 6:30 that evening, another American listening position reported movement east of Burt. Shortly afterward, an American patrol made contact. Gunfire erupted. 2 Americans were killed. Another was wounded. The survivors returned toward the firebase. Then mortar rounds began landing inside Burt. Only a handful, enough to make men look toward the jungle, enough to make radios start talking, but still nothing resembling the attack that was coming. The darkness deepened. Then another listening post reported movement. Then another. American patrols positioned outside the firebase were hearing men moving through several areas surrounding Burt, north, east, west, but they could not see enough to count them. That uncertainty was dangerous, because the difference between 30 enemy soldiers and 300 could not be heard clearly through jungle at night. Inside Burt were approximately 900 Americans. They had armor, artillery, aircraft on call. A small enemy force attacking that position should have been destroyed, but just before midnight, American troops outside the wire finally saw enough to understand the problem. Enemy soldiers began passing near their concealed positions. Not 1, not 10, large groups. And some of the American ambush patrols made a remarkable decision. They did not fire, because opening fire would reveal their locations, and there were too many enemy soldiers to stop. So American soldiers lay hidden in darkness and watched them pass. If you come here for the real battles behind the war movies America remembers, subscribe to Forgotten War Stories, because at Firebase Burt, the worst part of the night hadn't even started. Toward Firebase Burt, one group, then another. The enemy they had spent hours hearing was finally becoming visible, and it was much larger than anyone wanted it to be. At approximately 11:30 p.m., the mortars came. Approximately 200 mortar rounds fell in about 15 minutes. The darkness flashed white. Men dove into fighting positions. Steel fragments cut through equipment and earth. Radios erupted with reports. The explosions were not the main attack, they were covering it. Then, just after midnight, the jungle began moving. Enemy forces attacked from multiple directions. The northern perimeter came under pressure. Another major force approached the mechanized infantry on the west. RPGs and machine guns opened against the southern positions. More troops moved against Company C to the east. This mattered because there was no single place commanders could reinforce. Every part of the firebase was now demanding attention. If reserves went north, what happened in the south? If armored vehicles moved east, what protected the west? And somewhere beyond the wire were American patrols that had never returned. The first layer of American firepower came alive. M16, M60 machine guns, Claymore mines, recoilless rifles, quad .50s, twin 40mm guns, M11s firing from defensive positions. Artillery exploded beyond the perimeter. For anyone advancing through the jungle toward Burt, the volume of fire must have been extraordinary. Men fell. The formations kept moving. RPGs streaked toward American positions. One M1316 disabled, a duster was hit, and the attackers continued reducing the distance. 300 yards, 200, 100, then the wire. This was exactly where the Americans did not want them, because every yard the enemy gained began taking away one American advantage. Artillery could safely hit targets hundreds or thousands of yards outside Burt. It became far more dangerous when those targets were only yards from American foxholes. Aircraft faced the same problem. Mortars faced the same problem. Even machine guns had to know what was moving beyond them. The closer the enemy came, the more dangerous American firepower became to Americans themselves, and the enemy kept coming. The 105mm howitzers at Firebase Burt were built to throw shells miles through the air. A crew could fire without ever seeing the men being targeted. But that night, infantrymen began asking the guns to hit targets that were no longer miles away. The artillery crews lowered their barrels. Lower, then lower again. Until the howitzers were no longer behaving like traditional artillery. They could see the direction in which they were firing, and the ammunition loaded into the guns had been created for a nightmare, exactly like this one. M546, Beehive. Inside one round were roughly 8,000 small steel flechettes, tiny finned darts. When the shell functioned, those darts spread outward in front of the gun, a giant shotgun blast produced by a 105mm howitzer. At close range against massed infantry, it could be devastating. But there was another truth about Beehive. The flechettes did not know who was American. Anything standing in their path could be hit. That meant the gun crews had to know exactly where friendly troops were. American infantrymen needed to know when those guns were firing, and anyone moving through the wrong area at the wrong moment could be caught inside the same wall of steel intended to save them. The guns opened fire. Thousands of flechettes ripped across sections of Burt's perimeter. For a moment, the Americans had found an answer. Then, at approximately 2 in the morning, they discovered that it had not been enough. Enemy soldiers were already inside. Company C reported a penetration. Men had made it through the defensive line. That sentence sounds simple on an after-action report. Inside the firebase, it meant something terrifying. Until that moment, every American soldier shared one basic assumption: enemy outside, Americans inside. Now that assumption was gone. Movement behind the wire could be friendly, or not. A shadow crossing between bunkers could be an American running ammunition, or an enemy soldier who had already passed through the defensive line. Company A also reported enemy troops inside its sector. Radio contact with one American element disappeared. The Americans no longer had one clean perimeter. They had pockets of fighting inside it. The 105s fired Beehive directly across Company C. The effect was enormous. Much of the penetration was stopped, but some attackers remained, and Company C needed more men. A reconnaissance platoon was available. It should have been able to move forward and reinforce the line. It couldn't. The American artillery protecting Company C was firing so violently across the area that American reinforcements could not safely cross. The thing keeping Company C alive was preventing help from reaching it. If the guns stopped, enemy soldiers could move. If the guns continued, Americans could not. And now another crisis was developing outside the firebase, because 16 Americans were trapped on the wrong side of the battle. The Company C ambush patrol had gone outside before Burt was surrounded. Now the battlefield lay between them and safety. 16 men, enemy troops around them, the American firebase ahead of them, and between the two, American artillery, airstrikes, machine gun fire, RPGs. The patrol began taking casualties. An RPG killed one man, enemy fire wounded others, more went down. By approximately 2:30 in the morning, roughly half the patrol had already become casualties, and the fighting continued. Eventually, 11 members of that 16-man patrol would be wounded by enemy fire. One would be killed by an RPG. Another would die during the American close air support trying to keep the enemy away from Burt. Only 3 would escape the night without wounds. Imagine being one of those 3. Men you had walked into the jungle with hours earlier were now lying around you. Some wounded, some unable to move quickly, one already dead. The safety of Firebase Burt could be seen or heard ahead, but reaching it meant moving through the same fire being used to save it. There was nowhere clearly safe to go. Inside the perimeter, the Americans were facing the same problem on a larger scale. The attackers were too close, and the guns firing Beehive were burning through ammunition. Round after round disappeared into the darkness. Then the artillerymen reached for another shell and discovered there weren't any left. The Beehive ammunition was exhausted. The enemy attack was not. The crews had one choice: keep firing something else. They loaded conventional high explosive. Ammunition designed to explode against normal artillery targets was now fired directly toward enemy soldiers at close range. The larger 155mm guns also entered the direct fire fight. Armored vehicles shifted toward threatened positions, and M13 moved behind Company C. Another followed. Aircraft were directed against the jungle around the firebase. Helicopters added their weapons. Every layer of American firepower was now being dragged inward. And that is important, because looking at Burt from outside can make the result seem inevitable. 900 Americans, artillery, armor, air power. How could anyone possibly overrun them? But from inside the firebase, every additional weapon being used at shorter distance meant something very different. The enemy was still close enough to require it. The artillery was not firing miles away, it was firing across the perimeter. The aircraft were not bombing distant concentrations, they were being brought closer to Americans. The reserves were not attacking outward, they were trying to close gaps inside the defense. The battlefield was shrinking, and Oliver Stone was sitting somewhere inside it. He could hear an enormous battle. He could see explosions. He could feel the concussions. But years later, he remembered something bizarre. He could barely see the enemy. Then he heard the jet. The noise grew until it became something else entirely. An F-4 Phantom was approaching extremely low. Stone looked up. The aircraft appeared to be coming directly over the American perimeter. The roar was enormous. For Stone, there was no comforting knowledge that a pilot somewhere above understood exactly where every friendly position was. His reaction was simpler. He believed the aircraft was about to drop on them, that they were about to die. Stone threw himself into the closest foxhole and pushed himself into the earth. Then the bomb hit. 500 pounds. Somewhere frighteningly close. The ground shook beneath him. The explosion was part of the American effort to stop the enemy outside Burt. But from Stone's hole, the distinction between American fire and enemy fire was becoming almost meaningless. Both could kill him. That is one of the details that makes his later depiction of Vietnam in Platoon so effective. The terror is not always knowing that the enemy is coming. Sometimes the terror is not knowing where anything is, where the enemy is, where your own people are, where the next shell will land, whether the aircraft above you is salvation or about to erase your position. And still the battle continued. The Americans had prevented the breakthrough from becoming a collapse. But nobody inside Burt knew that yet. There was no clock counting down to victory. No narrator explaining that the worst had passed. Only darkness. And the next explosion. Until eventually, the volume of fire began to change. Sometime around 5 in the morning, the attack began losing strength. The enemy force started withdrawing. Not cleanly. Not instantly. Gunfire continued. Snipers and automatic weapons still threatened exposed movement. No soldier at Burt could simply stand up and announce that the battle was over, but gradually the enormous pressure against the perimeter disappeared back into the jungle. The wire had been penetrated. The artillery had fired direct. The Beehive had run out. American patrols outside had been devastated. The Firebase had survived. Now the men waited for enough light to understand what survival had cost. Oliver Stone had spent most of the night surrounded by a battle he could hear more clearly than he could see. Then the sun came up, and for Stone, what daylight revealed became another memory he would carry for the rest of his life. The darkness disappeared. The battlefield did not. Stone later described bodies blackened by fire. Others coated in pale residue. Some had become rigid in the positions in which they died. Some remained kneeling. Others were twisted into expressions that the violence of the night had left behind. For hours, Stone had heard an enemy force around him without really seeing it. Now that force was everywhere. The battlefield beyond Burt was filled with the consequences of the artillery, machine guns, and aircraft that had fired through the night. Stone later remembered carrying enemy bodies. Some were intact, others were not. A bulldozer arrived to prepare burial pits. The dead were carried or dragged toward them. Stone helped. Hours earlier, he had been hiding from an American bomb, unsure whether he would survive until morning. Now he was handling the bodies of men who had not. This is the part statistics usually remove from a battle. A number such as 379 can become abstract. A line in a history book. A number on a thumbnail. For the men who were there, each number eventually became something physical. Someone had to find the body. Someone had to identify it if possible. Someone had to move it. Someone had to bury it. And the Americans had their own dead, their own wounded, their own empty positions. Men who had been speaking hours earlier were no longer there. When the casualty accounting was eventually completed, the official U.S. Army history recorded 23 Americans killed, 146 wounded. For the attacking force, at least 379 dead and 8 wounded prisoners. Other accounts would give different enemy totals. Stone himself later remembered approximately 400. Some veteran sources recorded more, but the Army's official history gives us the most defensible wording, at least 379. And there is an extraordinary contradiction in Stone's memory. Hundreds of enemy soldiers had died around him. He had survived one of the largest fights of his tour, yet he later remembered that during the night, he had not fired a single shot. He had barely even seen the men attacking. War had happened almost entirely around him. And 19 years later, when he finally showed audiences what that kind of night felt like, he called the movie Platoon. Stone had not been forced into combat by the draft. He volunteered. He enlisted in the Army in April 1967. He specifically requested combat duty. He arrived in South Vietnam that September. He was 21 years old. The decision later became one of the foundations beneath Chris Taylor, the young soldier played by Charlie Sheen in Platoon. Taylor also volunteers. He also arrives with ideas about war that the war itself immediately begins destroying. Stone would later be wounded twice. He received the Bronze Star for valor. Eventually, he served in a long-range reconnaissance element of the 1st Cavalry Division. But on New Year's Day 1968, none of that future mattered. He was simply one infantryman among hundreds operating near Cambodia. Firebase Burt existed because of Operation Yellowstone. American forces were moving through northeastern Tai Ninh province, searching for major enemy formations and attempting to disrupt movement through the border region. Temporary fire bases allowed artillery to support infantry operating farther into hostile territory. Burt had been created only days before the attack. That made what happened there even stranger. The Americans had barely established the position, and major enemy forces were already preparing to destroy it. The official Army account would identify elements of the 271st and 271st and 271st 107th, 277 regiments of the 9th Division in the attack. What began as quiet movement outside the wire became one of the heaviest battles the 25th Infantry Division had experienced since Operation Junction City, and yet Firebase Burt would largely disappear from American memory, because history was about to become much louder. Less than a month later came Tet. Cities erupted. Saigon, Hue, Khe Sanh dominated headlines. 1968 became one of the defining years of the Vietnam War. Firebase Burt became one violent night among hundreds, except for the men who had been there. One of them eventually became a filmmaker, and he kept returning to that night. Oliver Stone returned to the United States in 1968. He eventually studied filmmaking at New York University. He spent years trying to turn his experience into a film. Hollywood did not immediately want it. Vietnam was still politically painful. The war itself was still being processed, and Stone did not want to make a traditional heroic war movie. He wanted confusion, exhaustion, fear, internal division. Young men who did not fully understand what was happening around them. Eventually, that became Platoon. The film appeared in 1986, almost 19 years after Burt. Stone never claimed the movie was a literal reconstruction of his service. Characters were composites. Events were compressed. Different memories were combined. Chris Taylor was fictional. The battle at the end was fictionalized. But Stone directly connected that climactic battle with the New Year's engagement he survived near the Cambodian border. And once Firebase Burt is understood, the DNA is visible everywhere. A jungle perimeter, night. Movement outside. Mortars crashing inside. An attack growing until the boundary between friendly and enemy territory begins disappearing. Fire support coming dangerously close. Men unable to understand the whole battle from where they are standing. Then mourning, and bodies. Stone did not reproduce Firebase Burt. He reproduced the experience of being trapped inside something like it. That distinction is far more powerful, because cinema can give the viewer knowledge the soldier did not have. A camera cuts to the enemy, then to the Americans. Then, overhead, the viewer always understands where the danger is. Stone had not been given that luxury. At Burt, he heard hundreds of men attacking without seeing them. He heard aircraft before knowing where their bombs would land. He survived a battle without understanding its scale until daylight. That helplessness became part of Platoon. Watch Platoon's climax knowing the story of Firebase Burt, and certain moments change. The mortars are no longer merely dramatic punctuation. Stone had lived through a night when approximately 200 mortar rounds fell in 15 minutes before the main assault developed. The disintegrating perimeter is no longer simply Hollywood chaos. Stone had been inside a firebase where enemy soldiers really penetrated American positions. The terrifying proximity of American firepower is no longer just spectacle. Stone had believed an American F-4 was about to kill him before its 500-pound bomb exploded nearby. And the morning after the battle, the film becomes especially difficult to separate from memory, because Stone had walked out in the daylight after Burt and seen what the night had done. That is perhaps why Platoon does not end its combat sequence with uncomplicated triumph. The survivors are alive, but survival has changed them. At Firebase Burt, surviving meant standing up after dawn and facing the physical evidence of everything you had heard. There is another detail Stone placed into the film. He appears briefly himself. During the final battle, Stone can be seen at a command position associated with the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry. For an audience, it is almost nothing, a cameo. For in Stone, the meaning is stranger. He had reconstructed fragments of his nightmare, and then put himself back inside it. Only now the men could stand when filming stopped. The explosions had been planned. The dead could get up. And someone could eventually shout, "Cut." Nobody had shouted that at Burt. Oliver Stone would spend years trying to explain Vietnam through film. But before there was a screenplay, before Charlie Sheen, before Willem Dafoe, before Tom Berenger, there was a hole in the ground. A 21-year-old soldier inside it. An American jet screaming overhead, and Stone convinced that the next bomb would kill everyone around him. There were 16 American soldiers outside the wire. 13 would be killed or wounded. Enemy soldiers were inside the perimeter. The artillery was firing through American defensive positions. The specialized ammunition keeping the penetration under control eventually ran out. And nobody inside Burt had any way of knowing that history would later describe the night as an American victory. Victory did not exist yet. There was only the next minute, then the next, until finally the sky began to change. 23 Americans would never see what came afterward. 146 had been wounded. The official U.S. Army history recorded at least 379 enemy soldiers killed, and somewhere among the survivors was Oliver Stone. Nearly 19 years later, millions of people sat safely inside dark movie theaters and watched the final battle of Platoon. They watched men trapped inside a collapsing perimeter. They watched explosions land frighteningly close. They watched night turn into chaos. and most never knew that the man directing those images had once been the terrified soldier beneath them. Stone did not invent the fear, he remembered it. Before America could watch the final battle of Platoon, Oliver Stone had to survive the night that taught him what it felt like. If you want more forgotten war stories that sound impossible but really happened, subscribe and follow us.